Well, we're sort of leaving off, we're not leaving off, we're coming in where we left off. Last week we were talking about how you can use a rectifier bridge, a diode rectifier bridge, to create a semi-automated reversing loop. And we're going to look at using such a device on an actual model railroad, my old garden railroad from years ago. And I was using this setup here, an LGB 1015 reversing loop, which is exactly what we were talking about, a diode rectifier bridge. And of course, what we're talking about here applies to any DC-only railroad. It wouldn't apply to a DCC railroad or an AC railroad. But you can duplicate exactly what LGB has created for garden railroading on any DC railroad with cheap and readily available parts. In fact, if you wanted to avoid the expense of the 1015 pair, you can construct your own for about $10. Anyway, it's an easy way to understand how this system works by simply reviewing the LGB 1015 pair here. Moreover, from what I've seen online, there's a tremendous amount of confusion about exactly what this system does and how to use it. So let's dive into how you set up an LGB 1015 reversing loop pair. The simplest of these two modules is the 1015T. And if we were to really study this thing, all this is a gap in the rails. It doesn't serve any other purpose. You could replace it with a couple of insulated rail joiners. I understand if you remove the cover here, you can actually connect to the to the rails there. There are screw terminals where you can connect. Never opened one up to look. But fundamentally, that's all that is. It's just an insulated rail gap. Now let's take a look at the 1015K. This is the heart of the system here, the meat and potatoes, as it were. Inside here is a bridge rectifier, the thing that we've been talking about. And the AC input to the bridge rectifier connects to the incoming rails here, the ones that connect to the rest of the railroad. And the output side of the device is the output, the DC output of the bridge rectifier. So here on this bridge rectifier on Amazon, you can see that these two terminals here are labeled AC, and these two terminals over here are labeled plus and minus. So the AC side connects to track power, the DC side connects to the reversing loop. It's important to test the DC output from the bridge rectifier to make sure that trains are going to travel across the gap here in the proper direction, going this direction. On the 1015K, you can see that there's an arrow marked here which indicates the direction so that trains will cross the gap and continue moving in this direction. Here on page 122 of the LGB User's Guide, it describes how to set up a 1015K and T reversing loop system. It tells you to mount your K track section, the one that has the bridge rectifier in it, at the entrance to the reversing loop, and the T module, which is just a gap, at the exit of the reversing loop section. So the very simple operation here is once your train is entirely in the reversing loop section, you throw the reversing switch on your transformer, on your power supply, and then as the train exits the reversing loop, the polarity will be correct, and the train will just continue on as though nothing happened. Because of the built-in bridge rectifier, of course, the train will always travel through the reversing loop in the direction of the arrow indicated on the 1015 module. And therefore, you can throw the reversing switch on the power supply without affecting the direction of the train at all, as long as it's inside the reversing loop. The downside of that is if you want to do any switching of your train while it's inside the reversing loop, you simply can't do it because there's no way to reverse the direction of the locomotive once your train is inside the reversing loop. So here on page 123 of the LGB User's Guide, we can see that what they're recommending is that you put any tracks that you want to do switching on, any sidings or anything like that, outside of the reversing loop section marked here in red, because once you're inside that section, you cannot back up. So go ahead and build that section into the loop anywhere you want to build it in, making sure that any switching that you want to do occurs outside of the isolated section. So this is the system that I used on my outdoor garden railroad years ago. I called it the Utah and Colorado. And I used the LGB 1015 modules on this simply because they're weatherproof and completely indestructible. And I had lots of switching going on inside of both of my reversing loops. And so I had to set that up as suggested in the LGB manual, where the isolated section has no switching in it at all. So in a way you can say that the reversing loop starts here and goes all the way around, but as you can see, there's a couple of items inside that loop. There's a locomotive shop and a small siding where I can set out cars. So I want to make sure that that switching area is outside of the isolated section. So I moved it to down here. So I put insulated rail joiners here, and what that meant was the reversing loop controlled by the rectifier bridge was just this section of track right here. And remember, with a reversing loop, your entire train has to fit into the isolated section, so that meant that I couldn't run trains longer than that section of track right there. However, I wasn't planning to run super long trains and everything fit neatly into that section. So if I were planning to go around the reversing loop, I had to be sure that this switch was always aligned to the right path. The points were directing the train to the right, so that I would enter from this direction. That way, when I got down here to the reversing loop, I could continue on, because the polarity beyond here is always going to be in this direction. And as soon as my entire train is in the isolated section, I will throw the direction switch on my power supply so that the train will continue on through the reversing loop once it crosses this gap, heading back down the main line toward the other end of the railroad at Durango. So what we're doing here is exactly what we've been talking about. The only difference is I've moved the gaps and the isolated section to only part of the loop. So now I had access to my locomotive shop, and I could set cars out at the siding without having to worry about the reversing loop. Now, notice also that there's one added little piece of complexity here, and that's that there's a Y at the far end of the loop here. That way I can run trains around this loop continuously in a circle if I want to. But more importantly, it allows me to switch the locomotive shop and the siding here. Let me show you how that works. I had actually isolated this little section of the Y here and put in another bridge rectifier and gap. In other words, another LGB 1015K and T in the track right here, with the polarity set to go in this direction. So I had the LGB 1015K up here at this end of the isolated section and the 1015T at the other end of the section. That meant that trains could only travel through this part of the Y in this direction. So if I wanted to run trains around this loop, it's a 100-foot loop. So if I wanted to put a short train on here and just let it go around while I barbecued burgers or something, I could easily do that as long as they ran around this loop in a counterclockwise direction. But more importantly, if I wanted to set a train out on the siding over here or back a locomotive into the locomotive shop over here, I could bring a train into the loop, continue all the way around to the siding here, and then back the train into the siding, cut the train off, and then bring my locomotive forward past the Y here, and then back that train all the way up to the locomotive shop and park it in the locomotive shop with everything facing the proper direction. And all I had to do was work the reversing switch on the power supply and of course align the points on the turnouts, and I could more or less forget about the reversing loop sections as long as I remembered not to try to go through there in the opposite direction. Now we have the exact same problem down here on the west reversing loop, only it's even more extreme. I've got the entire switching yard here at Durango, plus a passing track on the return leg of the loop going back in the opposite direction, and a stub siding that goes off to a mine over here. But the solution is very much like it was at the other end of the railroad. I put the 1015K module right here, in other words the bridge rectifier right here, and the 1015T module, in other words just isolated gaps in the rails right here just before the passing track at Durango. If there was a problem with this, and there sort of was, it was really crowded. So if I wanted to pull a string of cars out of the yard here at Durango, I couldn't bring my locomotive any farther than here, which meant that I couldn't pull more than 3 cars out of any one track before running into the 1015K module, and I couldn't proceed past that, or I wouldn't be able to back up. And an even more crowded and similar problem up here, and that's that the gap in the rail was really close to the passing track here at Durango. So I wouldn't be able to back up and pull any cars out of that siding, although that rarely came up as an issue. I didn't use the track in that way. All of these things are dependent on your track plan and your operations, and in this case the passing track here at Durango was essentially just that. It was the depot, and you could pull a train into the siding there and another train could come around you. But because of the isolated section running through the bridge rectifier, in other words the KT modules, direction coming through here was always in the same direction, and entering the passing track at Durango always happened from the left side here heading toward the right side. So here again it sort of makes switching this yard a no-brainer. All I have to do is align the points on the turnouts and throw the direction switch on the power supply to do any switching. I just need to keep in mind that I can't bring my locomotive past this point right here unless I'm prepared to continue on in this direction all the way to this point, because in this isolated section my reversing switch doesn't work. And it's really easy to automate this whole thing at this point so that trains will continue from the Rockwood end to the Durango end, automatically turn around and go right back where they came from up the same track, as long as I can figure out some way to automate the reversing switch controlling the direction of the main line. And that involves some sort of train detection system so that I can tell where the train is and then automatically throw the reversing switch. And that is a subject for next week. So I hope you've been able to figure out what we're talking about here with these LGB 1015K and T modules, and how you can very easily build your own system that works exactly like this out of a bridge rectifier and 4 insulated rail joiners, and therefore use this system on any scale gauge railroad, whatever you want to do, as long as it's a DC track-powered 2-rail railroad, and it'll just work. And if you're working in the garden and you're using LGB track, I still like the LGB K and T modules in spite of their $80 price tag, simply because they're absolutely indestructible and very easy to use. You just put them into your track plan and there they are. Well, anyway, we will be continuing with this, and I hope you want to follow along and therefore become a subscriber. And the easy way to subscribe, please subscribe if you're not a subscriber, is to click on the upcoming blue button. Zoink, right there, the blue button. Well, I'm not sure how you found this video on the internet. I hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you on Sunday because we've got something to show you from a train show. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.